Okay, so well, we're exactly 7:30, 19:30, so we'll make a start. Welcome everybody in the room and welcome anybody on Zoom. I think we're now up to about 33 people on Zoom, which is 34, and we've got 14 in the room here, so we're up into the close to 50-ish. Anyway, welcome, and this evening we've got a talk by Mark Brett, who is a Senior Project Officer at Cotswold Archaeology. And Mark has given his talk a very interesting title, which is Friends, Rovers, Countrymen. As all of you might know, Cotswold have been doing excavations at Eastington on the location of Forest Green Rovers' planned new stadium and academy and training grounds. Interestingly, just over the other side of the M5, another archaeology company have been excavating the line of the future Cotswold Canal route, where they've had similar issues. They obviously had to do pre-construct archaeology there as well. Mark is a very experienced professional archaeologist. He's been with Cotswold since 1993 and managed numerous projects, including looking at buried mosaics at Chedworth Roman Villa and doing a survey of those. He's been involved in structural remains investigations at Llanthony Priory in Gloucester and also the Gloucester Castle site at HMP Gloucester. And also, again, in Gloucester, been involved in a lot of medieval wall investigations, including in situ mosaic floors within medieval walls. He's given me a huge long list of other projects he's been involved in, which I'm not going to read out or bore you with. I'm sure it's fascinating, Mark, but I think we're much rather interested in hearing about what you've got to say today rather than reading out your complete CV. Yeah. So with I think I'll hand over to you, Mark, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Good evening, everyone. And thank you for the invite. It's always nice to speak to local groups about local projects, so yes, thank you for that. So I did actually meet some of you when we were on site earlier in the year. I hope you've recovered from that, those that turned up. It was absolutely awful afternoon weather-wise, but hopefully you enjoyed it. You did get to see the excavations firsthand, and you did get to handle some of the better finds that we had. So I've got my fingers crossed that all goes okay tonight. I've not done a talk remotely before, so Neil or Phil, you'll have to give me a shout if anything starts going awry, please. Okay, so our excavations began straight after the Christmas and New Year break, beginning of this year, and were completed pretty much the last day of March. We were instructed directly by Ecotricity, who's the client, and they funded all the work. The excavations were monitored by Rachel Foster, the county archaeologist for Gloucestershire, and the archaeological advisor to Stroud District Council. So this is where the site is located. So it's just to the south of junction 13 in the M5. We've got the A419 there, and this is obviously the A38 Roman Road. We've got Whitminster up here and Eastington down here. CA has been involved with this site for over 7 years now, and the training pitches site comprises just one element of a much larger development, which is to include a new all-wooden stadium, I'm sure most of you know this, and a green business park. I should probably say at this point that our findings at this stage are only provisional. We've yet to start work on any post-excavation analysis, as we're due to go back to the site for further phases of work. The results of all of which will be ultimately published in either a monograph or an article in a relevant archaeological journal. The post-excavation analysis will include the archaeological features themselves, the finds, the environmental evidence. So some of our initial interpretations will undoubtedly change by the time the project reaches publication. So on this slide here, you can see where these 3 pitches are here. That was our site. The site and the wider area have previously been the subject of small-scale excavation, heritage desk-based assessment, geophysical survey, and evaluation trenching. These investigations identified activity ranging from prehistoric period to the modern era, the most significant activity within the site itself occurring in the Roman period. The current site lies immediately adjacent to the site of a known Roman villa, known possibly erroneously as Whitminster Villa, first recorded in the 1920s by Sinclair Baddeley. It was first investigated archaeologically by excavation in 75-76, and then again in 2004. These investigations appear to identify a modest 4th century cottage type farmhouse with a group of adjacent kilns, as reinterpreted by Eddie Price in 2006. The remains have been extensively disturbed by medieval Rudgeon furrow ploughing, but as well as in situ structures, finds included coins, wall plaster, roof tiles, opus signinum, and many tesserae. Resistivity survey of the villa site itself was conducted by Gadarg in 2003-2004. This indicated the presence of a number of features, including ditches, pits, gravel extraction pits, and furrows throughout the area. So you can see the furrows. This is the barn here. And this is basically the area where the structures previously found. And the whole of the proposed current development site was subject to geophysical survey in 2015. So our site on here is this area here, and the villa is supposedly in this area here. So this is an interpretive plot of the survey results for the training pitches site. The survey detected anomalies on the site of presumed Roman villa, including a possible enclosure, which you can see here, surrounding the villa or the buildings, and occupation and or demolition material. It was stated that magnetic responses within the possible enclosure could be, at least in part, due to more recent activity, including excavations and gravel extraction. Interestingly, no anomalies representing structural remains were detected by that survey. Ditches and field systems extending across much of the survey area east of the motorway were located, with the densest concentration being in the vicinity of the villa. So that's all of these sort of linear anomalies picked up by the geophysics, mostly around where the villa buildings are. So following on from the geophysical survey, CA evaluated the whole of the development area again in 2015, and we excavated a total of 82 trenches over the whole area, including the small part of the site over the other side of the motorway. So our training pitches area is here, and obviously the villa there. So the evaluation indicated that ditches identified within the south central part of the site confirm the presence of a rectangular enclosure identified by the preceding geophysical survey. Finds recovered from a number of these ditches within the evaluation confirm that it's likely of 3rd to 4th century AD date. Within the enclosure, truncated remains of a Roman building of some status were revealed. part of a further Roman structure, which is one of the ones that was identified during the excavations in the 1970s, was also exposed again. Evidence of probable Roman sand and gravel extraction was identified in close proximity to the identified structures. So in this photo, you might just be able to pick out very small patches of remnant in situ tesserae mosaic. So unusually, desk space assessment followed the evaluation. Normally the desk space assessments are done as the first part of the project, and they're normally followed up by geophysics and or trial trenching. This time the assessment heritage appraisal wasn't done until 2020, and a desk space assessment was done last year. These were both undertaken by ourselves. So the assessment was informed by a number of sources, including historic, documentary and cartographic records. And this is a table that shows all the different resources that were looked at to go towards that assessment. So that includes the National Heritage List for England, Gloucestershire HER, Gloucestershire Archives, aerial photos, British Geological Survey. So the assessment, as well as identifying obviously the Roman part of the site, it also stated that in the medieval period, it occupied a peripheral position to the foci of settlement at Eastington, occupying part of open field system and meadowland, likely associated with Eastington Manor. Crop marks an excellent ridge and furrow on the site, and its wider environs confirm that the site formed part of medieval open fields. The evidence indicates that during the post-medieval period, the site continued to form part of the wider agricultural hinterland in the parish of Eastington. The Stroud Water Canal, known as the Stroud Water Navigation, opened in 1779, ran through the southern part of the site and was infilled prior to the motorway construction. So this is an extract from the tithe map from the 1840s, and you can clearly see the canal running through the southwestern part of the site. So the desk space assessment identified previous investigations and sites of interest within the current development area and also the surrounding vicinity, including prehistoric find spots and an Iron Age to Roman settlement and cemetery approximately 500 metres west of the site, and a further possible Roman early medieval settlement approximately 440 metres southwest of the site. So those would be over the other side of the motorway again. Early medieval activity was indicated by the recovery of 11 sherds of 5th to 6th century AD grass tempered pottery recovered within close proximity during excavations in 1969 associated with the construction of the motorway. The document also assessed the impact of the proposed development on the heritage assets of the site and the vicinity. So this photograph shows the location of the previously identified villa buildings. These are mostly located just in front of the barn in this sort of area here. Unfortunately, the fields we were working in just behind the barn. So planning permission was granted in 2020 for construction of the training pitches associated access, parking and landscaping, with a condition that a programme of archaeological work was undertaken. Rachel Foster specified the scope of the work, which included excavation of the training pitches site, and subsequently an area of approximately 2.63 hectares, which I think works out about 6.5 acres, was stripped of overburden. Here you can see how we go about this. We strip off the topsoil first. That gets put in a big heap, and then we strip off the subsoil separately. That gets put in a separate heap, and then we're down onto either the natural substrate, the archaeological level. The hedge line, I should say, the hedge line here was left in initially because they had Ecotricity, the contracted specialists, come in and actually move the hedge. And what they did was they filled in the gaps along the southern boundary of the site with the hedge from this hedge line. And then we were able to strip the rest of that. So once the site was fully stripped, we could produce an accurate plan of the exposed archaeology and formulate an excavation strategy in accordance with an agreed written scheme of investigation, which Rachel Foster had to approve. That sets out what percentages of each type of feature is required to be hand excavated, and also details of environmental sampling requirements, artifact collection, and such like. Here you can see our final plan of the site, showing the archaeology in grey. The known villa buildings are located just to the north. So that's the old barn. And this is the area where the villa structures have been found previously. This is a more closer up view of the site, and you can see all the green stripes running across all the way through. Those are obviously the furrows, and these are the geophysical anomalies picking up the furrows. So the furrows obviously severely impacted on the archaeology, as had been previously observed in the earlier excavations. So what exactly did we find? Well, we identified finds and features from a range of periods, the earliest of which was early to Middle Bronze Age, buried soil deposit, pits, ditches dating to the transitional Late Iron Age, 1st century AD, and then boundary enclosure ditches, pits, post holes, human inhumations, stone deposit, trackways, all dating to the Roman period. We haven't got exact dating on the Roman features yet. We're still waiting, obviously, for precise dating from the specialists for that. 2 sheep burials located within the central part of the site are presumed to date to the medieval, early post-medieval phase of activity, as well as a section of the 18th century canal. So this is the canal here, and then just inside our site. Number of gravel extraction pits. So these bigger features, they're all gravel extraction. And some of those predated the ridge and furrow, some of them post-dated. So some of those could well be Roman as well. So the earliest evidence of activity on the site comprised 2 shears of pottery of early to Middle Bronze Age date. So that's broadly 2400 to about 1100 BC. They were recovered from a pit in the southern part of the site, so I believe around here. Nothing else of that date, nothing earlier. We then go straight to the sort of late Iron Age, early Roman period. So these are the features that we identified as likely being that transitional phase. So we had a length of ditch up here, a patch of buried soil here, and a couple of pits here. They had exclusively late Iron Age to early Roman pottery in them. So moving into the Roman phase of activity, this is where it starts to get obviously quite busy. There are two main sets of ditches. So the southern one here, which curves around and does that, and then this other set here, which goes across the northern part of the site. The ditches in the northern part are those depicted on the geophysics forming the southwestern side of the enclosure around the actual villa. So they're part of the enclosure that encloses the villa itself. The main ditch alignments, so northern one and this southern one, they're located along the edge of the higher ground before the land then just drops down into the floodplain of the River Frome. We picked up a trackway here. You can see trackway E, sinuous trackway, gravel trackway, which may have been used to move livestock down to the lower ground for seasonal grazing. So this is a section through the northern set of ditches. There are at least 3 phases of ditch in here. So we've got one at the end here, got one in the middle here, and that cuts one on this side here. Quite large, you can see that's 2 metre scale there. And this is a section through the southern set of ditches where we essentially picked up 2 phases of ditch. So only one episode of recutting. This is a section through where the 2 sets of ditches run at either side of the trackway. So we've got part of the southern set of ditches here. This is the northern ditches here. And then in the middle, we've got this gravelly material, which you can see extending down towards the floodplain. The finds from the gravel included pottery dating from the mid-2nd to 4th centuries AD, animal bone, ceramic building material, metal objects, and metallurgy waste as well. So as we were stripping the site, this is the point where we realised that we had a group of 5 human burials, seemingly all buried together in the same spot. I think when the group came out, we'd actually lifted the skeletons. So I think it was just the empty graves that the group got to see, unfortunately. So once we've established that we have human remains on the site, we then have to apply to the Ministry of Justice for a licence for their removal. They have to be covered over and screened from the public. Wasn't too much of a problem where we were. We didn't have many people wandering through that site. Quite often you can be in locations where the public can see exactly what you're doing. So the licence states that any removal or disturbance of the remains shall be effected with due care and attention to decency. So obviously, as archaeologists, we treat the remains of the individuals with reverence, and we'd rather not disturb them at all. But my thoughts have always been that the development has been approved, they have to be moved, so we should do as good a job as we can to move them carefully and respectfully. So a total of 11 individual human burials were recovered. Ironically, same number as in a football team. These were recovered in varying degrees of preservation. 6 were found relatively dispersed across the site on the higher ground within the sets of ditches, the 2 sets of ditches, whilst the remains of these 5 individuals were found grouped together just above the breaker slope down to the floodplain, to the south of the ditches and the trackway. So one of the burials within that group of 5 survived only as part of the pelvis, a small part of the pelvis there, and the lower limbs. It'd been buried with a blade at its right hip, and burials with knives apparently uncommon in the Roman period, so there's a possibility that this could be post-Roman. And this is a close-up photograph of that knife, and this is obviously prior to conservation. You should see it coming back looking quite different to that. Another burial in the same group, which was a female of 35 to 45 years of age, was buried presumably wearing this very fine twisted copper alloy bracelet. And another, we found a coin. Hopefully you can just see that right in the center of the photograph there. That was found by the spine, obviously, of this individual. So if it had been somewhere near the face, obviously we'd have been thinking of the common practice by the 4th century of, placing a coin in the mouth. It's a fair for Chiron, the safe passage across the River Styx into the afterlife. We did actually have a burial exactly like that, with a coin in the mouth, not too far away at Fox's Field in Stonehouse in 2011. Unfortunately, all the coins are now with the specialists, so we don't have a close-up shot of this one to show you. Now this just looks like a jumble of bones. It's obviously been heavily disturbed, most likely by ploughing. The initial assessment by our osteoarchaeologist has indicated that it's the skeleton of another 35 to 45-year-old female. You probably can't see it very well in this photograph, but there's a small group of articulated bones up here. And we initially, this is that group of bones, more of a close-up. We initially, during excavation, assumed that it was a neonate, and maybe that the mother and the baby had both died during childbirth. But it's now transpired that these small bones are actually from a neonate calf. So we'll have to do a bit more analysis on that, and a bit more research to find other examples of that. A number of the graves contained iron nails, suggesting that certain individuals at least were buried in coffins. And it's intended to have at least some of the human remains radiocarbon dated. And they'll all be subject to full analysis. But unfortunately, the early indications are that most are not well enough preserved to be able to identify many pathologies, which is a bit of a shame. So our osteoarchaeologist, Sharon, has been able to identify that of the 11 individuals encountered, 6 were probably male, 2 of these were aged 30 to 45, and 4 45 or over. 3 were female, 1 of 30 to 45, and 2 of 35 to 45, and 2 were neonates. The ages of the adults is obviously interesting. They all obviously lived well into adulthood and didn't die young. Due to the poor preservation and limitation of aging techniques, it isn't possible to accurately estimate this beyond either over 35 or 45 years. But it does suggest that diet and health were sufficient enough to provide this longevity. The location of the neonate burials, which were found close to the villa, may be of some significance, as infant inhumations are often found within the settlement context. And I recall a number being found inside and around a villa we excavated at Cannington in Somerset a few years ago. And of course, we should remember that infants were treated differently to adults when they died. They were excluded from certain burial rites because they weren't seen as fully human at birth. They became more human as they got older. So this is how we currently take aerial shots of things like our burials. We've got a camera up on a pole here, and this young lady is controlling that with a tablet on the ground, so we can swivel it about, focus in and out and all sorts. We've not yet invested in a drone ourselves, but for more interesting sites, we do contract specialists in who do use drones for our aerial photography. So we had this irregularly shaped deposit of stone, which may represent a disturbed foundation for a timber building or a base or some kind of working surface. This partially overlaid the southeastern set of enclosure ditches. So it places it fairly late in the Roman sequence. It was about 11.2 meters long, 4 meters wide, and it was truncated along each side by later furrows. So where we've got the brown material there and the brown material here, those are furrows. So we don't know exactly how far it did extend. It was generally 1 stone thick and contained both dressed and undressed blocks, as well as a number of fragments of tegula. You can see one of those there. It was partially overlain by a black silty clay deposit, which is this material here, and that had lots and lots of finds in it, lots of later Roman finds. It had animal bone, ceramic building material, metallurgy waste, iron objects, which included a cleaver, pieces of work stone, 2 copper alloy bracelets, and a total of 377 sherds of pottery dating to the mid to late 4th century. So obviously quite late in that Roman sequence. That was just from cleaning off the black material onto the stones. So very fines rich. Interestingly, we found another cleaver in a late Roman female's grave at Fox's Field, which is the site I spoke about a short time ago. There's some suggestion that this deposit, this stone deposit, represents demolition material from the villa itself, and may in fact represent early post-Roman activity. It'd be interesting to think of occupation continuing into that early Anglo-Saxon period, and the villa being exploited for its stone and other resources. Hopefully, analysis of the environmental samples recovered from the material overlying the stones will give us an indication of its use and date. So here you can see where we've excavated some slots through the stone deposit. There's one here. There's one that goes through the furrow here, one that goes through the furrow here, and another one that goes through the deposit here. This was just to check to see if there were any actual in situ structural remains within that deposit, or indeed if there was anything buried underneath. But it just went straight down onto the natural substrate. We had numerous discrete features, so pits and post holes. These were mostly contained within the two enclosures formed by the two sets of ditches. Post holes were all identified in isolation, apart from two, which were located towards the eastern end of the site. They could obviously form part of a drying rack or some other two-post structure. A number of the pits located within the sub-square enclosure at the southeastern end of the site contain very dark fills that are noticeably much darker than a lot of the other fills of the other features. And notable within this group was pit 1780, which you can see here. This was 3.6 meters long and 2.7 meters wide and 0.3 meters deep. So quite sizable. Contained two fills. So you can see a light fill at the base and then a darker fill above. And from the latest fill, we had quantities of animal bone, metal objects, and 4th century pottery. So this obviously goes with the later Roman activity. We took a number of environmental samples from these features, and hopefully that will help us interpret what activity they were related to. So after the Romans, as mentioned just now, further analysis will help us define if occupation of the site continued beyond the end of the 4th century and into the early Anglo-Saxon period. Evidence for activity in the post-Roman phase excuse me, is often difficult to identify, and the material culture is rare. We have to jump to the medieval or early post-medieval period for our next datable phase of activity on site, reflecting the findings of the desk-based assessment, which places the site within medieval open fields. It's within this period where the land comes under intense agricultural use through ridge and furrow cultivation. Furrows evidently associated with at least 3 phases of ridge and furrow cultivation and present across the entire site, and survived as relatively prominent earthworks prior to the start of the current field work. So when we turned up, They were very prominent as earthworks. Many of these survived to approximately 5 meters in width and had caused extensive truncation to the earlier archaeological remains, which were largely only identifiable within the narrow strips between the furrows. Many finds of mostly Roman date were recovered from the furrows themselves, likely to have been disturbed from earlier underlying features. These included many metal detected finds, including around about 50 coins, Roman coins, as well as numerous other metal artifacts. So the furrows have disturbed stuff that was in the earlier features. It's ended up in those, and that's where our metal detectorist has found them. You can see in this photo where you've got nice yellow natural substrate between the furrows, and that's where we find the bits of archaeology surviving. You can see where we've put our slots, so we target those. This is one of 2 sheep burials identified within the central part of the site. It was actually contained within a furrow and had pottery dating from the 14th to 16th century with it. That gives us good dating evidence for that and also for the furrows. So a length of the former Stroud water navigation opened in 1779, extended along the southwestern edge of the site, measured up to 13.5 meters wide and was cut from the top of the subsoil. It wasn't excavated by hand, it was recorded in plan. And this uppermost fill that you can see stretching across the site, that was full of swan mussels, some quite large swan mussels. So this indicates that it's likely to represent material that was previously dredged from the canal and dumped upslope on the opposite side to where the towpath was down here. And then when they've come to backfill it, all they've done is just pushed all that dredged material back into the open canal. So this is the length of the canal at Whitminster. Hopefully it looked something like this when it goes through to Eastington. Obviously it's intended to restore that whole length. So the missing mile, which is the part that hasn't been restored so far, that's the part that runs through our site. So when it is restored, the route is going to be moved, so it's going to move further south down towards the river. So we had at least 8 large pits, I showed you earlier on, indicated on the plan, both regular and irregular in plan. And these were interpreted as gravel extraction features. 4 were investigated by mechanical excavation, and the largest measured over 18 meters in length and 13 meters in width. So they're considerably sized features, they're substantial. It was 1.1 meters deep, and the backfill contained a small quantity of post-medieval brick and glass, giving us good dating evidence for at least this one. Elsewhere, it was evident that at least some of the large quarry pits were cut by furrows and could therefore be interpreted as a possible Roman date, as were a number of similar features identified in the preceding trial trench evaluation. So they found quarry pits, obviously in the trial trench in 2015 up by the villa. This, we're fairly certain, is a hollow way, extended through the northwestern part of the site, just to the south of where the villa is. It is on the same alignment as the later furrows, possibly suggesting some contemporaneity. It was up to 5.9 meters wide, 0.6 meters deep. It was cut by a furrow along its length. So it contained gravel and possibly, again, originally a surface. Interestingly, location of this feature appears to correspond with one mentioned by William Choules in Glavensis in 1993. He wrote, on an alignment approximately south-southwest from the villa site, a number of very large stones were once visible in the banks of the River Frew. The previous landowner was always of the opinion that they were the remains of a Roman bridge. It seems there is a possibility that some of these stones are still to be found in that area of the river. So during our excavations, I did follow the course of this down into the next field, and there is actually a linear dip going all the way across that field down to the river. But unfortunately, the banks were too overgrown for me to get a good look and see if there was any stone visible. So move on to some of the finds now. As I say, most of the finds are with the specialists or conservators now. So I've only got a few images to show you of those. The majority of the metal artifacts were found by Lee, who's our metal detectorist friend from Cheltenham. Here we can see some of the coins, a mixed bag. So we've got 4 Roman examples here, including this very worn silver one, which is a denarius Septimius Severus, and that dates to 198 to 200 AD, so quite close, quite tight dating on that one. Its reverse shows Fortuna with cornucopia and holding a rudder resting on a globe. Above that, rather bizarrely, is a Spanish real of Ferdinand and Isabella from around 1474 to 1504. Still no idea what that was doing there. Not all of the metal finds were found by Lee and his metal detector. This is my young colleague Tom, looking very pleased with himself after he's found his first ever Roman coin during hand excavation. So rather unusually for a Roman site, we only recovered one brooch. This is a hinged Colchester derivative, T-shaped type, and it has got settings for enamel on the bow up here, but none of that survives, unfortunately. And this dates from the 2nd century AD. Got this really nice, lovely little key. She's likely to be for a small wooden casket or something similar. It was found within a Roman context, although there is some question as to whether it is actually Roman. Again, specialists should be able to confirm that. This was found by Lee. It's a 17th century copper alloy sword belt fitting, which is likely to be from the English Civil War period. This is an X-ray of some of the metal finds. So all of the metal finds get X-rayed. It helps identifying what they are. Obviously, you can see underneath the corrosion. And it also helps with conservation strategy. So here you can see a thimble. There's the key. That's the brooch there. And then that's the twisted copper alloy bracelet that was with the burial. This is an X-ray of the knife that was with the other burial. And so we move on to some of the pottery now. So this is the earliest pottery that we found. This dates the early to middle Bronze Age. So, as I say, 2,400 to around about 1100 BC. So early indications from the Roman assemblage suggest that it's fairly utilitarian, indicative of a modest rural farmstead of the time. This is a Dressel 20 amphora, an olive oil carrying globular bodied amphora from southern Spain, and it dates to the 1st to the 3rd century AD. This is Central or East Gaulish Samian. It's a bowl, and it dates to the mid to late 2nd century. This, hopefully, you can make out, has part of the maker's stamp on there. We haven't identified the maker yet, but that should be ultimately possible. And these are sherds of, most of us are familiar with, local Severn Valley ware, which dates to the 2nd to 4th centuries. Find a lot of that, obviously. This is the same type of fabric, but this is a platter, and this is a bit earlier. This dates to the mid 1st to early 2nd century. So indicates that we've got activity on the site, at least all the way through the Roman period. This is Southeast Dorset black burnish ware. This is a jar of cooking pot, and this is sort of later Roman, so 3rd to 4th century, and it has got some decoration on it. The one on the left is a grog-tempered Severn Valley ware variant. It's a bowl, and that dates to the mid 1st to early 2nd century. And then, so that's quite early. And this one is 3rd to 4th century, and it's a Roman greyware, conical flanged bowl. This is a fragment of tegula. So we know that in the earlier excavations over the actual buildings that they were recovering at least some tegula. Obviously gives us an idea of what the roofs were like on the buildings. So the excavation presented us with opportunities to offer a number of outreach events, including tour of the site by some of yourselves that fateful afternoon, which was probably one of the worst days on that site. And this was something that Ecotricity were keen for us to do. This is myself and Joe showing around the group from the William Morris College, which is next door to the site. And that's a further education college for young people with learning difficulties. So they brought round about 3 individual groups. and a fair amount of media attention on this site. So one day we were visited by the BBC, ITV, Sky Sports News, and the local press. And of course, Mr. Vince was there. So for those that don't know, he's the owner of Ecotricity and the chairman of Forest Green Rovers. And this is him being interviewed for ITV. So in conclusion, we've been fortunate to have excavated part of what was the Whitminster Villa estate, not the actual villa buildings themselves, but immediately around it. We've encountered some of the individuals who may well have lived or worked there. We were tantalisingly close to the villa itself earlier in the year, but we're really hopeful that we'll be asked to return soon to the field to the north, where we know the buildings are. Ultimately, we'll know a lot more about the site and its occupants once all the field work and the post-excavation work is completed. And this information will obviously be accessible by anyone that's interested through the publication or through various other media. I'm really hoping that I'll be able to give my next talk on the actual villa itself, which should obviously be very interesting. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. That was fascinating. I think what I particularly liked is really getting down to the nitty-gritty details of developer-led archaeology. Looking at ridge and furrows, looking at things cutting through ridge and furrows, really taking into account all of the long history on a site. So it's nice to focus on the overall big picture as opposed to the details that are good at the headlines. So yeah. Thanks so much for that. It was really, really interesting, really good. Are there any questions coming up in the room here before we get on to anyone else? Anybody in the room here got any questions? Not at the moment.
Where are the finds?
Okay. Hold on a second.
Where are the finds at the moment? I thought I've seen some of them in the Corinium Museum recently, particularly the brooch.
I'm not sure any of the finds would have been deposited with any museum yet. It's still early days. We've got lots of analysis to do. I say most of them are with specialists.
The key in the brooch, I thought I saw on television. Maybe it was that time they had the TV there.
I didn't see that.
Did you hear that, Mark?
The brooch was on TV.
Yeah, with the key.
Oh, right. Oh, I didn't realise. Maybe they'd borrowed it.
Okay. Any more questions in the room here? Oh, Phil's got a question.
What was the villa when it was dated? I think you said was reasonably late, but your finds go across from the 2nd century through to the late 4th century. So presumably there's been occupation there for quite a long time. Do you know what do you know? Or hopefully you will know more about the villa in due course, but what's the background to it at the moment?
Well, the likelihood is that the original house, let's say, that was on the site may just have been wooden or a very simple stone building, and there possibly hasn't been enough work done on the villa itself to be able to work out whether there is anything earlier underneath the later villa building, which was probably a bit more grander than the original house. If it's anything like villa that we excavated in Stoke Gifford. You know, there's a progression across a couple of 100 years where the house just gets bigger and bigger, gets added to. So it might be that there's an early phase there. It just hasn't been identified as yet.
And you said that you also identified some sort of late Iron Age Roman transition material as well. So thus far, again, you've not found any evidence of settlement there apart from the finds.
No, just one or two small features. So, as you say, no evidence of settlement for that sort of period. But obviously, activity on or very near to the site during that transitional time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've just got one question actually, Mark. Do you know what the time scale is for the next phase of work in the field to the north of this one you've been working on?
No, I wish I did.
Okay.
Desperate to go back, but yeah, we haven't been told yet. I think there may be, I don't know, there might be delays with planning or something.
Okay. Do we have any questions in the audience for the on the Zoom side? You'll have to either type your message on the chat or put your video on and wave. Anybody there? Doesn't look like it. Any more questions? Oh, hold on a second. Question from Mike here.
Mark, you mentioned a couple of sheep burials. These seem to be fully articulated animals, and I think you said they were early medieval. Any indication of what that was all about? Is there some sort of ritual, or what did you think?
Again, I'm really sorry, but they probably haven't been looked at in any great detail yet. So it's still too early to say, really. But we have got obviously an animal bones specialist here, so they will be getting looked at. He'll be able to tell us everything he can ascertain from that. You know, might see cut marks and things, but I'm not aware of anything from when we excavated them.
But they weren't in association with any human burials then?
They weren't. No, they were away from the human burials.
Great. Thanks. It's me again, Neil. Yeah, on the same line of thought, I was quite intrigued by the neonatal calf next to the human burial. Is there any precedent for that? Is that unusual or normal?
I know sometimes you get burials with joints of meat and things, so that the individual has something to eat in the afterlife. So that may be what that's all about. But specifically, neonate calves, whole calves being buried with somebody, I've not come across that before.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Okay, Terry's got a question.
Mark, over the years, there've always been debates about villa estates, Roman villa estates. From what you've shown us, it looks as though conceivably you've got the outlier of a larger villa estate. Of course, you're not that far away from Foster, which is very sizable establishment. Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, as you say, it could well just be an outlier that's connected to a much bigger estate. That wouldn't be unusual.
Okay, no more questions in the room. I can see no one waving at me. Can't see anybody on the, we're getting some messages coming through on the text from Rose Hewlett saying, will other parts of the Forest Green site be excavated, i.e. where the stadium will be, which is on the north side of the 419 Link Road?
I think the results of the geophysics and probably the trial trenching probably indicated that there's not a lot of archaeological interest over on that side. It could be that Rachel Foster, might ask for a watching brief or something during development. We just have to wait and see.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, there's no more chat messages. There's nobody waving at me on the video, and there's no one in the room shouting at me. So I guess that's the end of the questions. So thank you ever so much, Mark. That was really excellent, and we did remember to record it. So we'll send you a copy.
Thank you very much.
That will also go on our website as well for the for Gloucestershire's website, so it could be picked up. Anybody couldn't attend tonight.
Okay, I hope you found it interesting.
Very much so. Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So maybe we could have a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much.